Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the history of ACPE. I'm very excited to be recording this. The presentation itself has a history. It's been a while of our consulting with various people, loads of different people who have had input. And now, today, this presentation has has been created by Chris Brown and Bill Scrivener and myself, and we will all be participating in this presentation. There have been as many histories of ACPE as there have been certified supervisors and certified educators. We have a passion for our profession, and it shapes who we are as persons and as professionals. And each one of us has shaped our organization as well as our own history and our colleagues and our careers, really. Most of what's been written about ACPE has focused on the foundations of how we came together as an organization in the middle of the 20th century. In particular, today with this presentation, we think back to John Thomas and Robert Lees, who served as historians for our organization, collected videotapes and pictures galore that we're still trying, as you know, with our weekly ACPE newsletter to identify. And then also Bill Scrivener, who is filling the role of history manager and coordinator currently and will be helping us with this presentation. What we're hoping to do today is to fill out this original what would you call it? What do you call that? Well, I can't think of what it is, but basically to fill out our living history, to move beyond these historical foundations and to look at other trends and milestones, especially since the 60s when we came together as ACPE. The webinar will be broken into the following sections. First of all, background. Quite simply, who are we when we say that we are ACPE now? The foundations that I already referred to. The foundations are in fact those names and collectives, organizations, phrases that we have learned, we've heard about through our oral history and the written history, on our grandmother's knees, in their laps. We have heard about Anton Boysen and the Living Human Document. We've heard about Richard Cabot and the coming together of the medical field with religious education to create a clinical method that continues to shape our methodology today. Then there's Helen Flanders Dunbar and the Institute for Pastoral Care and the Council for Clinical Training. These are the familiar touchstones of our foundations. We'll then talk about moving from those foundations into the organizational consolidation in 1967. And then the collaboration. We have one slide on collaboration, which really touches on all those organizations that we have worked with and tried to work with to create mergers, to find a common voice. And that is, in fact, the most important piece of this, coming together with others of similar purpose and goals and passions to have a voice in the wider society around the things that we so care about. Growth, we have several slides on our growth, really since 1967. Who have we become? Where are we now? And then finally, creating our future. How do we keep the living human document alive? And how do we expand it to a living human web that is inclusive to all and open to change? Big questions as we move into the future. So in terms of the background, ACPE is, as you can read here yourselves, the premier Department of Education recognized organization that provides the highest quality of CPE programs for spiritual care professionals of any faith or no faith and in any setting. We are creative about how we are providing this education, and we change with the social needs that present themselves to us. The depth of our training enables our students to realize their potential strength in caring for others in their spiritual health. The theoretical foundations that have been there throughout since our foundations and really continue today, as we know, in terms of our theoretical theoretical challenges to our training educators now. We continue to work with a form of pastoral theology, as we always have. The terminology, pastoral and theology, are not as inclusive as we would like, and so we're now talking about frames of meaning making, ways to reflect on what we do that allow for all kinds of different philosophies and approaches. Psychology, because we grew up initially in the middle of the 20th century, along with the introduction of psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis into the medical and clinical field, we have drawn from psychology in terms of how we understand the human person and how we understand even a social psychology and a developmental psychology, particularly in terms of who it is that we're educating and caring for. Educational theory is super important in the sense that we are interested in how we do what we do, how we know if it's successful, how we communicate with those that we're educating, and how we keep our theory and practice alive. And then last but not least, group dynamics have always been part of the theoretical underpinnings that we have worked with. The questions around group dynamics have to do with how do groups behave? Simply, how is it different to experience oneself in a group than it is as an individual? And how do groups impact us as spiritual care providers and leaders and persons as we represent this great field of ACPE? For slide number 7, where we begin with the history of ACPE and or CPE and the foundations, I'd like to introduce Bill Scrivener, again, our current historian for ACPE. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Kitty. History of CPE, like the history of a lot of movements, began in pockets around the country, but it was not something that was born out of nothing. It's important to know that in the 20s, there was ferment happening in the whole field of education. And John Dewey was challenging our schools and our educational theorists to reconsider how they thought about education, and was challenging people to move away from a strictly academic focus in education to a focus that included experience and the integration of that experience with the knowledge that was gleaned from books. So there were a number of people who were very critical in this, Anton Boysen, Richard Cabot, Helen Flanders Dunbar, and the man who's not pictured here, William Keller. And I'll say a little bit more about each one of them. Anton Boysen was a congregational pastor in Massachusetts who in his 20s suffered a nervous breakdown, essentially. And he was being treated at Worcester State Hospital. And in that time of treatment, he began to understand, he actually had a blazing insight that his mental illness really was a spiritual struggle. And as he worked with that understanding, he not only began to regain his mental health, but began to understand not only mental health issues, but spiritual issues in a new light. And so when he was ready, he began a program to help people learn what he was learning. And so he brought seminarians from the Yale Divinity School up to Worcester State Hospital, where he was now the chaplain. And during the day, they worked as recreational therapists, and in the evening, they would talk about the patients that they were visiting and what they were learning about the patients and about their illnesses, and not incidentally began to learn something about themselves. And it was Boysen who gave us the term, the living human document, his way of talking about learning from our interactions with people as being, at least as, if not more important than the learning that we get in our books of theology and church history and so forth. Next was Dr. Richard Cabot. Dr. Cabot was a physician in Boston. We think of him as the father of both medical social work and hospital chaplaincy. And he began to develop clinical training methodologies. So he would bring in seminarians from the Episcopal Theological School and from Boston University School of Theology. They would function as chaplains in the hospital and then would gather, they would gather in seminars in order to talk about what they were learning about the patients and about themselves. We can all thank Dr. Cabot for creating the verbatim. It was he who first formulated the verbatim as a learning tool, and we have all dealt with the joys and vicissitudes of verbatims since his time. Then there was Helen Flanders Dunbar. She was a physician, a very remarkable woman. She was an early pioneer in the whole field of psychosomatic medicine. As you can see here, she had quite a number of varied degrees. She was brought into the CPE movement by Anton Boysen, and when the Council for Clinical Training was formed, she, along with him, became the early leaders. She was one of the early advocates for clergy-physician collaboration in the treatment of patients. That was a pretty new idea back then, and we know that in some places that is still a struggle to bring into reality. But this was one of her signal contributions. She wrote a very important book called Mind and Body, which was all about psychosomatic medicine. It's a book that I remember reading in my first residency back in the early 70s, and I think it's still relevant today. And last but not least, but certainly less well known, is Dr. William Keller, who is a Cincinnati-based physician who created, within the context of the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio, the Cincinnati Summer School in Social Work, which later became the School of Applied Religion. He did something similar to what Anton Boysen was doing. He would bring seminarians in from all over the country, and they would spend their days shadowing social workers from the University of Cincinnati School of Social Work on their home visits. And then in the evening, they would gather for seminars and they would discuss their experiences. So the foundations were being laid, and their initial manifestations more formally were with the Institute of Pastoral Care and the Council for Clinical Training. Because as men got together and were engaging this kind of training and methodology more fully, different strains of approach began to appear. And so in Boston, you had the Institute of Pastoral Care, which championed rationality, self-control, professional pastoral training, very optimistic view of humanity's perfectibility. But I would say that in terms of their focus, their emphasis on pastoral training as the key focus for CPE was the most important. And then in New York, we had the Council for Clinical Training, which championed inner conflict, non-rational feelings, freedom through self-awareness. And the primary focus, I would say, for the council was on psychodynamics, the understanding of the inner person, both in terms of those who we were seeking to help and our own inner persons. And so as these two groups began to grow and develop, they moved farther and farther apart, and they became somewhat antagonistic towards one another, and they were suspicious of each other's methodologies. If you talk to some of the older supervisors today, you will, if you delve a little more deeply into conversation with them about their understanding of what CPE is about, you can still see some of these threads alive and well. So then the CPE movement began to evolve and expand. So not only do we have the council and the institute doing their work, in the 40s and up to 67, the Lutheran Advisory Council, Southern Baptist Association joined with these two groups in leading and contributing to the movement. These two groups became active, I think in part because they wanted to be sure that both their theological and their cultural perspectives were being represented at the table. And so they functioned separately while remaining in dialogue with each other for quite some time. And you will sometimes hear talk about the Committee of 12, which was a group that represented each of the four movements, and they met regularly into the 50s in order to foster dialogue and collaboration. It's important to note that this was a movement that really took its sweet time to finally come together in 1967. They did not rush into it. The primary ways besides having their ongoing dialogue was that these two groups began more and more to share and collaborate with the accreditation and certification processes, which was not only eye-opening for the different groups, but ultimately really helpful as they began to see that what the others were doing wasn't really as crazy as they thought it was. And so further trust was engendered. And so in 1967, these four groups finally came together to form ACPE Incorporated. This all happened formally at a conference in Kansas City in 1967. Following that, Chuck Hall became the first executive director, and he served until 1983. And so as a closing point, it's important to note that at this juncture in 1967, ACPE was primarily a white Protestant male organization. And the real challenges for ACPE and CPE in general lay ahead. It's also worth noting that as ACPE began to grow and to mature, it entered into collaboration with a variety of other organizations, particularly the Association of Professional Chaplains, National Association of Catholic Chaplains, and Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains. We worked with each other to better understand what we were training people for and how we could better inform each other's understandings of pastoral ministry. And now I will turn the mic over to Chris Brown.
Thank you, Bill and Kitty, for inviting me to be a part of this, what I call history in the making. And as you heard earlier, Bill talked about the struggles and the challenges of our organization, and about the founder, Anton Boyson, with his mental health struggles and his challenges. And our organization continues to go through challenges and struggles. But there's a gift in that. And the gift is that we are learning how to learn and live with each other in the midst of our challenges and our struggles, in the midst of our suffering. And in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, the ACPE had a lot of challenges, had a lot of struggles, just like our society today. There were hardly no women at the table. You heard earlier about Helen Fleming Dunbar. But the voice, where was her voice in the 60s and the 70s and 80s? Our organization consisted of predominantly white Christian men. I've learned when I joined this organization that being Black, being gay was not easy. And I have learned that that is a part of just not a struggle, but it's also a gift, and how that has helped so many people in the world to receive healing. And the world needed healing then, and the world needs healing now. But healing looks different, it sounds different, it's shaped different for different cultures, different people. And as educational and religious and social institutions recognize that, they also recognize that there was a time that there was a need to confront biases and prejudice. And the ACPE started to lead that in their evolution for people and all persons to find that voice. These marginalized groups included women, persons of color, non-Christian spiritual and religious groups and individuals, and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer groups and individuals in the world. And let's talk about some of the barriers and some of the challenges of these marginalized and disenfranchised groups, some that you are a part of and feel so connected to. Women in CPE, as Bill shared earlier about Helen Fleming Dunbar, we have women now in our leadership of our ACPE who is leading us into, I believe, into the strength of our organization, as well as the longevity of our organization, because I love ACPE and I want ACPE to continue to provide healing and continue to do what our organization mission and vision. And with that, it's just not being Black, it's just not being a man. I need my sisters, and I need those strong women who have been called to this organization to lead us now at this present time, as such as Helen Turkerson, who was the first woman to be certified in our organization. And in 1983, there were only 25 women who were certified in our country. And Cecilia B. Williams was the first African-American woman certified educator. And Celsa Coloma became the first Latino woman certified educator. Yes, there was a need for women in our organization, but those women were white women. And Cecilia, as long as Celsa shared with me their challenges and their struggles to being a woman of color, try to get certified in our organization, it happened with a lot of work. And it was just not with persons of color, but those white women also said, come join us in our fight to take with injustice. So those women in leadership, as I talked about earlier, that we have the presidents of the ACPE. You see Kathleen Turner, Jo Claire Wilson, Joan Hemingway, Sally Schwab, and Robin Brown Hayco, and our current chair, Amy Green, and our chair-elect, Ms. Lissa Walcott-Luggett. Joan Hemingway became the first woman to serve as a regional director. And Joan was also known for when she said not farewell, but she said farewell to her ordination, because she, at the time, shared with the world doing that she was a lesbian woman. So we're going to talk about that later, but I just wanted to highlight Joan and her strength to lead our organization, to stand up against that to part of homophobia and that injustice. And Teresa Snowden now, who is the first African-American woman to be the bishop in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. She was also the first and only woman of color to be our executive director. And she was the second woman of color to be certified in our organization. As persons of color, George Polk, who is the father of Rim, who is the first certified educator in our organization. George, our supervisor, had a chance to share with me the stories and challenges of walking with George in the pain. And when his boss told him to fire George because he was a person of color, and he refused. He said, I did not know what I was going to do. I was saying to my boss, no, I could lose my job. But he said, well, just something not right. He said, because this man was called by God. This was a man who was smart, who he felt that had all of the credentials, but you're going to let them go because he's Black. And he stood up against that. So to hear that, to know that George was not alone in his process. And in 1980, there was a total of 800 ACPE certified educators. Only 21 were persons of color. And Uriah Beverly came along in 1993. Not until 1993 there was a person of color as president, and Robin Brown Hayco followed in 2012, and Carlos Bell in 2017. So we are making strides. And to help us make those strides, to help empower us, it's the RIM Ethnic Multicultural Network, which originated in 1984 by Cameron Bird. Cameron Bird stood up at the National Conference in 1980 and said that this organization was too white, this organization was too middle class, and that we need to address the racism and sexism that's going on in our organization as well as in the world. So Cameron was not alone in that. So in 1980 in DC, Cameron, along with George Polk, Uriah Beverly, and others, formed the Racial Ethnic Multicultural Network. And it was just not for persons of color. It was for any person who felt like they were marginalized, felt like they did not have a voice, felt like that there was no room at the table. And RIM now is currently alive and well in our organization, and our organization has continued to grow with our non-Christian spiritual and religious group and individuals. We're just not Christians. It's the world consists of more than just Christianity, but Judaism, Muslim, Islamic, Buddhist, other faith traditions are part of our organization now. Rabbi Jeffrey Silverman became the first certified educator in 1984. Which spurred the birth of the Jewish Chaplain Network and the NAJC. Jeffrey shared with me his story in the early 80s when he was at a conference, and the conference was like a strangers at the mist, and he was like, everybody was singing Christian songs and singing hymns, and he said, I felt so out of place. He said, I felt like I was just a refugee. And he shared with a person of color. He said, how do you deal with this? And he learned from RIM to start a network for other Jewish chaplains in the process of supervisory education at that time. He said, yes, he was the only rabbi to be certified, but he said, I just don't want to be the only one. We do not promote tokenism in our organization. And he said that it's just not going to work with him being the only one. And being the only man. So let's look at women rabbis. So Phyllis Torak and Julie Schwartz became the first Jewish female ACPE certified educators. And as we talked about the non-Christian spiritual and religious groups earlier, Trudy Hershon was the first certified Buddhist in our organization, as well as we have others, Tahara Akmal, in our organization as well who's Muslim. So we have many women in leadership who are from different faith traditions. The LGBTQ community, which I'm a part of, and Jim Corrigan, who is the founder of the LGBT queer group, shared with me how painful it was to be the first, to be the only, but he said he knew that there was more out there. So he, along with a colleague, said that we need to go out and recruit others for the LGBTQ. So they wanted to keep it under low key, under wraps at first. And the word got out and they formed their own group. But somewhere, somehow, a colleague of ours, which I will not name, came to the group and went out and shared with other colleagues that there were people who were gay and lesbians, transgender, and it was just so disgusting to have that in our organization. But that did not stop Jim and others to form in 1992 the ACPE Gay and Lesbian Network. And Joe Claire was one of the 9 to start the LGBTQ network in our organization. And she was also the first openly gay president in 1998. As we look back at our history, we also look at the future. And we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Are we there yet? Yes, I celebrate with ACPE the evolution, what we have done, all of the healing that we have provided, all of the learning that we have obtained, but it is nothing if we do not share it with the other parts of the world and connect with other people. So it is just not about diversity. It's just not about inclusion. It's not about having a room at the table. It's saying, I have room at the table and I am hungry, and are you going to feed me? And not what you want to give me, but what I ask for. So I want to really celebrate what we have done in our organization. I really appreciate being a part of this presentation, because now I can hear my voice and you can see someone that's different, that's done a lot of work to where I am. So I want to thank Bill and Kitty again for asking me to be a part of this, of our history. So thank you.
Okay. So this brings us to just a few concluding remarks for this webinar. And I want to share that I'm so struck by, in a sense, the 2 different threads of this presentation, looking back to really the brilliance of the minds in the 20th century, our founding fathers and mothers who were able to voice the need for the integration of spirituality and religion in medicine. These were courageous and really visionary folks. And then the fact that our organization has been able to look at itself and realize that those folks, for all their brilliance, were also all Caucasian and white and really did not represent our society as a whole, and really didn't represent academic thought as a society, for the society as a whole. In 2017, we celebrated 50 years of ACPE. Many of us were there in Minneapolis and know that we were also in the midst of our organizational redesign. So we were celebrating, and we were celebrating in turmoil. We have a national staff that is outstanding, including an executive director who has challenged us in a variety of ways, partly strengthened by the fact that he is not an ACPE certified educator. He is an educator, a person with great perspective on some of the quirks of our organization and someone who's led us into a new degree of civility in our interactions with each other. I also want to mention that the national office and the staff there has introduced us to forms of technology that have made us so much more efficient as an organization and also much more connected. When you think about even this kind of a webinar that includes some talking heads. We are now an organization that has a membership of 750 active educators, 237 spiritual care professionals, and 296 accredited centers that have 147 sites, satellite spots where they can continue to develop the CPE that is offered. We have other centers currently interested in joining our organization and seeking accreditation, and that's very exciting. We also know that we need new folks. We are an aging organization, and we have loads of retirees or nearly retired folks, and I happen personally to feel that probably the most important thing that we do as an organization is to certify new educators, and in that process to bring all of what we've presented here in our history into the training and the introduction of those folks to who we are as an organization, and also to learn from our new folks who are the ones who will be leading us into the future. So that's it for now, and we invite responses. We invite your voices to add to this living history, this history in the making. Take care. Bye.